Welcome to my show today. I am so excited to have Reena Patel, another social worker, on my show today. And we will be discussing something that's very dear to both of our hearts, embodied health across cultures, mental health across cultures. So Reena, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing on the show today. She's the Director of Education for the Trauma Resiliency Institute. She earned her master's degree in social work from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India, excuse me. And actually, we both went there, and I went there in person with her, and we did a Community Resiliency Model workshop, which was really exciting. This was back in 2019. Now, she received the NASW, that's the National Association of Social Work's Emerging Social Work Leader of the Year for Arizona in 2018. She has worked on the San Carlos Apache Reservation and with the Pasquayaqui tribe as a mental health therapist. She's also been a faculty associate for Arizona State University School of Social Work and has taught courses in diversity and oppression in the social work context. And she has a deep interest in the multi-generational effect of trauma and post-traumatic growth in marginalized communities. She's traveled domestically and internationally as a Community Resiliency Model faculty. And she has traveled to India with me, actually, and the Trauma Resource Institute as part of the Sea Learning program, which was inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And we were so happy to be very close at hand with him. And she helped to translate our media materials into Hindi. So today we're going to be talking about resilience. And, we both have read a book by Resmaa Menakem, and we like some of the things that he has to say. He's also a biological somatic-based therapist, but he says resilience is built into the cells of our bodies like trauma. Resilience can ripple outward, changing the lives of peoples, families, neighborhoods, and communities in positive ways. Also, like trauma, resilience can be passed down from generation to generation. So even though we're going to talk about trauma, we're also going to talk about what does help us cultivate our well-being, and why do two models that we both believe in, the Trauma Resiliency Model and the Community Resiliency Model, what is it about them that helps us when we work internationally in the way that we do, not only embracing people who have had so much suffering and trauma, but also helping them heal and thrive. So welcome, Reena. What is on your mind today as we're getting started?
Oh, Elaine, I'm so honored to be here. It's just, I know I've said this to you before, but it's such an honor to have a platform like this to share some of these experiences that we've both shared, but also some of the things that that really drew me to this work specifically. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm here, as Elaine mentioned, in Phoenix on the Akimel Otham and the Hohokam ancestral lands here in Phoenix, Arizona as well. So thank you so much, Elaine, for inviting me today.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you. And also, I want to talk to you a little bit about that and the importance of the land acknowledgement. And I know that I'm in Claremont, California, and I'm sitting on the Gabrielino and Tongva ancestral lands. And tell us why that's an important thing for us to acknowledge.
Yeah, so, the introduction you had mentioned, I worked, I really had the privilege of working for two different tribal nations, one San Carlos Apache and then Pasquayaqui tribe, both here in Arizona. I didn't really, growing up in Arizona, I didn't really understand a lot of what had happened to Indigenous communities and what continues to happen, I would say, to Indigenous communities today. And so it was through that process of understanding and learning what had happened to the tribal nations of this land and what actually continues to happen right now with so much land and culture being jeopardized through legislation, but through also in many other ways as well. And, for me, the land acknowledgement, when I think about it, it's a way for us to honor our Indigenous communities today, but also to pay homage and respect to the ancestral lands and who they belong to, and that we are actually just caretakers of this land, right? And so, one of our wise friends that we have in common, Elaine, Wendy Flick, she had said it so beautifully to me when I moved to Phoenix from Tucson. She said, I know you will be a wonderful steward of this land that, has been given, right, from the Akim, well, and not given voluntarily, but now I'm here and I'm taking care of it. But just to have that respect and that honor to know where I reside now, where my home is, but being able to be a caretaker and a responsible caretaker of this land. And to, and I think in the work that we do at the Trauma Resource Institute, having that perspective and the lens that we don't exist in a vacuum, right? That there's so much that came before us, and there's so much that's going to come ahead of us as well. And so for those reasons, I think the land acknowledgement is just so important, if for nothing else, to educate people, and so that hopefully we don't repeat history again in this way.
Well, and so I know the other thing that I've certainly felt that you've been a leader in the Trauma Resource Institute that I co-founded, that you're now the director of education of, is in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one of the areas that I think that you brought to awareness for all of us is the aspect of intersectionality. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and what that means, because I think that it's important for us to understand the different
Yeah.
ways that we show up in the world, not only how we view the world, but how others view us.
Absolutely, Elaine. And so if it's okay, I'll maybe share a little bit of what we mean by intersectionality for folks that may not be familiar with the term, then talk a little bit more about it. So I actually, it's funny, I didn't know what this term was until I started to get deep into my social work studies, and I wish I had known about it a lot earlier. But when I stumbled across it, and actually it was when I was a faculty member at Arizona State University studying diversity and oppression, that the intersectionality was a huge focus of the coursework. And this term was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a scholar and activist and also a lawyer. And so she was in that time fighting a case for a Black woman who was facing discrimination in the workplace. And what she found was there was no legal term to talk about what this woman was experiencing in her lived experience as a Black woman. The judge said, well, this workplace isn't discriminating against Black folks or women. And she was making the argument that because this person was a Black woman, she was facing a unique type of discrimination. And so Kimberly Crenshaw said, we need to encapsulate this in some kind of term so that we can understand that when we have a meeting place of identities, there is a term for this. And so originally it was born out of this idea of race, class, and gender. Since then, though, intersectionality has really grown to encompass so many parts of our identity. And I think in our trainings and how we've really come to adapt it, and the work that we do at the Trauma Resource Institute, we both look at it as a meeting place of our identities in places that we've all experienced some suffering, right, with the world, but also a place where we can celebrate and experience incredible amount of strength and resiliency and a sense of self that's much deeper than just what we would maybe be able to understand just by looking at each other, right? And so I love that when we think about the nervous system and the body, which I know we're going to be talking about today, what it means to have that embodiment, intersections show up for things that you can see about me, but also the things that you can't see, right? That I have in my lived experience. And the same for you, Elaine, right? When I'm working with you or I'm talking to you, there's things I can see and things I cannot see about your lived experience.
And so that's where our intersections come together. So are the intersections something that we ourselves identify, or is that other people look at us and identify? Because you may look at me and say, oh, you wouldn't know that my great grandmother was a native Mayan, and that my mother and grandmother immigrated to the United States from El Salvador. I have very fair complexion, so that's not something that you'd necessarily think about me if you just saw me.
Exactly. And I think both are probably incredibly important, right? How we're perceived by the world, as you said earlier, is so important, because that's going to impact how the world treats you and how the world treats me, right? But then there's also the piece of our own story and what that means for our own intersectionality, how that shapes how I view the world and how I view my own lived experience. And so I think both can be very true, because both would impact how we navigate the world.
Well, and I think as we've been discussing in the Trauma Resource Institute, the issue of intersectionality, we also have been, I think, really looking at how we are viewed and how society views us can also lead to advantages. That, what you're saying about, when Kimberly Crenshaw first coined this terminology is that you may not necessarily realize that you have certain advantages that others don't have by many different things, by
Yeah.
your age, by your gender, by the color of your skin. And I know that now I just turned 70, so that's an older person. I don't feel 70, but some people may look at me and go, oh, well, what does she know? If you're 20, you look at a 70-year-old and think, that she could be out on the pulse of what life is all about. Perhaps you might think that. And I'm going, well, guess what? I've lived a lot of life. And so maybe I do have some wisdom here. But I think that we might classify someone based on, their age, how they look, whatever it
Yeah.
might be. And then we make determinations that may or may not be correct, but also that there can be disadvantages, right? And how people perceive you, in that maybe not giving you a fair chance, may not be able to look at you in the same way when you're trying to gain access to healthcare. And we know there's the issues of healthcare disparities that have happened, but for many people of color, as they have approached just trying to have a gynecological exam, and are they going to be treated in the same way as others? And we know that
Right.
exists. So it's not something that is benign. It's something
Yeah.
important for us all to think about, because I think it also can help us sometimes shape social policy. And
Absolutely.
how do we we talk much in our organization about equity and justice, and maybe you can touch upon that a little bit in terms of how do we, with the intersections that happen that may lead to an equitable distribution of things that are important for society, how do we walk with justice in
Yeah.
mind?
Yeah, I think you bring forward a really important point, Elaine, because something that really comes to me as you say that is, I think there's this myth that somehow by redistributing our resources or working towards justice or correcting the system, that the folks that do have advantage or privilege will somehow lose out. And I don't think that's true. When I think about what happens to us as a society, if we are to correct the system, everyone can have the fruit, right, of the system, that we all can gain, and that we can have a much better community and a much better society, healthier for everyone, for all children, for all adults, if we were willing to do the things that we needed to correct the system, right? If we were able to give the access that's needed to make sure that there isn't inherent biases and structures in place and power structures in place that really do favor particular groups over others, right? Intentionally or unintentionally, right? Because as we know now, things are running on its own axis in so many ways. And so I think I think that's one piece that really comes to mind, is that, if we are to do this work and walk in this way, that all of us ultimately will benefit, no matter what side of this you're on. And for all of us, that looks different in all of our identities. I'm thinking ability status for me. In my ability status, I can walk, run, jump, play. I can do those things. I can go down the sidewalk. I don't have to worry about getting into buildings, right? And so for me, it would benefit me as well to have a society in which people who don't have my ability status, right, can also access every building, right, and every street corner, and go to every park. And so I think, even looking at it from all of our identities, it's really important to know that we don't lose out if other people are able to have access as well. And it's just,
Well, and I think about justice. Sometimes look at it because I work a lot with schools.
yeah,
And I think about when I was a child, there was no accommodations made for children who learned differently.
yeah,
And so that means that a child could be very smart, but because, let's say, of a certain processing challenge that they had, they might need extra time in order to accomplish taking a test where other kids could do it very quickly. But now we know there's extended time for tests. You have a bona fide learning disability, that there are different things that are really codified where children then can have justice and more equitable treatment. And so then maybe that child who would have failed in school now is soaring in school
yeah,
because accommodations have been made to change the system. We now have special education teachers. We have so many different ways that children who learn differently can succeed. And I look at that in the same bucket of what we're talking
yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah,
And how
absolutely.
important that is then for all of society, because then you could have had someone who couldn't maybe go on and, let's say, get their degree to become an engineer, but now, oh, you had dyslexia, so what are we going to do to accommodate that? So we know, because you could be a brilliant person and learn differently. And there's so many people, like I remember one of the, there's so many different people who've had dyslexia. I think Albert Einstein had dyslexia, right? And if you learn differently, because I think he was actually mute, he didn't talk for much of his childhood. And so they might have thought, oh, there's something, he's intellectually not abled, which of course he was one of the most brilliant individuals that ever lived on the face of the earth. So I think that there's so many different ways why intersectionality is important and why we have included it as part of our VISTA within the Trauma Resource Institute as we train people in the two models that I know that we both believe in very strongly. So let me get to another question. I mean, we have a few questions to talk about today. And so when we talk about adversity is not destiny, what does that mean to you? Adversity is not destiny.
It's one of I know a lot of trainers say this is one of their favorites in what we teach. And so I was reflecting on this prior to the show today, and I was thinking about there's a quote that I'd like to read by Gemma Benton, and she's a Native American artist from the Menominee tribe, and she's Filipino. She said, "Our ancestors knew that healing comes in cycles and circles. One generation carries the pain so that the next can live and heal. One cannot live without the other. Each is the other's hope, meaning, and strength." And I love that because I think about adversity is not our destiny. And again, in the sense of our generations, right? That we think about it just in the model, we talk about it with our adverse childhood experiences or the things that have happened to us, right? And in our life. But I love about both the Trauma Resiliency Model and the Community Resiliency Model is that I can take that generational perspective, that I can really take a step back and look at what generations before me have endured, right? The pain that maybe they have gone through, so that I can live and heal, but also what my leg of that is, right? That the pain that I'm experiencing perhaps right now, right, because of my own lived experiences, but what that means for the next generation as well. And I say that from a cultural lens. I say that as somebody who's grown up with two cultures, knowing that the intergenerational stress on my life and my body has been very real. And so I know that there are pieces that I'm still working through so that the next generation can live and heal. And so I see that all as part of a continuum. So when I think adversity is not destiny, I think of the power that I have, but also the power that my ancestors have now given to me, that have said, here you go, Reena, and passed it on so that I can now look at the next generation and say, adversity is not your destiny, and here you go. And I do believe that the work I've done with these models in my own body have really created a whole new dimension of what that could look like in terms of the healing that can take place for the next generation.
Well, I'm kind of also thinking about both of us are first generation. Yeah. And so, here, my mother came from El Salvador, your parents came from India. And I mean, I know why my mom came here. She came here for a new life. She came here for a better life. And I know that she and my grandmother did a lot of different tasks in order to be able to make money, in order to come and live in the United States. I mean, I remember very clearly my dad driving my mother and grandmother to the tomato canning factories that were in Santa Clara County because they canned tomatoes. Now, people might not, if you saw how my parents, prospered in this country, they may not have said, well, oh, you did that when you were younger, but that was part of their history. Yeah. And that was part of what they were hoping that they could accomplish. They worked hard in order to have myself, who was their child, who was the first to go to college. So that was part of the fruits of their labor that I know that they felt very proud of. And I imagine you must have stories like that from your family as well.
Absolutely. I think about my grandmother. Both of my grandmothers didn't go to what we would consider high school. They both did their education in India. And I think about 8th grade is where they stopped. Right. And so, looking at my life now with a master's degree and, the work I'm doing, I love that quote. And it's slipping me who said this quote. But you are, become your ancestors' wildest dreams. And sometimes I think of that because I think how amazing would that be, just to be able to live out life that way. always thinking about what would their wildest dreams be in this moment for me to do and to continue to work towards. And some of it, I'm sure they'd be happy, and some of it not so happy, looking at some of the
Well,
choices they made.
well, I think that
Yeah.
is kind of one of the challenges, is that when you come to another country, you're influenced by so many different things that are outside the scope of what they thought was possible. Like, I can remember that when I met my husband and we fell in love, and we went and talked to his family that were all from a part of Norway, and they were a certain religion. And we said, well, we're going to get married in this church. His grandmother, who was probably 80 at the time, said to my husband, "You're not going to get married in that church, are you, Jimmy?" And so, of course, we did end up getting married in that church, but that wasn't quite part of her paradigm, that her grandson would marry someone who was of a different faith. And I know that happens
Yeah.
also in Indian culture, I imagine, as well.
Absolutely. Well, and Elaine, you're familiar with my love story. And so for those of you that are listening, I'm a Gujarati American. And so in Gujarat, especially in the community I'm from, I would say I would one of the first women in my family to not have a arranged marriage in the traditional sense, but also in the not so traditional sense. And I ended up marrying a Mexican American, wonderful person, and so that did cause a lot of distress and rifts. But I think one of the pieces that of the work that I'm thinking about in terms of the generational work, right? So that way, marrying who you love, even considering that as a radical act, right? And what that looks like.
Yes, exactly. And there can be a lot of suffering with making that decision, right? And so I think those are the kinds of things we're talking about when we're talking about being first generation. We're talking about coming here from with a certain vista of how life might be different. That I love that about that your children may live out your wildest dreams as you come to a new country, and that may happen or may not happen, right? But I think that's one of the reasons too. We both have seen suffering in our own families, and that here we both became licensed clinical social workers that work in the area of trauma. But many people don't realize that when we're a social worker, we may work in the area of trauma, but we also work very much with both feet in the work of strength and resiliency, and how to empower and help people heal. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit now also about why you believe, and we talked about embodied healing, right? Why is that important? And when we talk about the biology of the human nervous system, and as you have, not only worked in the US with different tribes and different cultures, but also you've worked internationally. I certainly saw when we went to Mumbai and we were at the Tata Institute that people really globbed on to the model that we were teaching there. Mm-hmm. And here it was kind of created in the United States. It's what we call a biological approach rather than a Western approach. And, why was it helpful to them? So maybe you can, we're going to be taking a break in a little bit, but if you can just, mention a little bit right now, and we'll talk more about it after the break.
Absolutely. I think typically we talk about when thinking about this question that we all have a nervous system to access. But, I want to take it one step further, because I realize, there's a deeper piece here that resonates around both TRIM and CRIM, both the wellness skills and the reprocessing around trauma. And that is having access to parts of ourselves that otherwise are very difficult to have access to. And so I think it goes with what we were just talking about, Elaine, which is these experiences of our ancestors are housed in our body. It's in our cells, in our DNA, it's in our lived experiences, right? Things that you are aware of and things that you're not. And I think that something that's really incredible about the models is that we have access to these parts of ourselves that's much deeper than what we could do with other types of work, because we are working with the body. Right. And so I do think that that's something that comes up for me when I think about why are these models so cross-cultural? I think the other piece is that I know I've benefited from is also being able to access the wisdom and the strength, not just for myself, but also of my history, right, in my body. So there are parts of this model that are much deeper than I think what we could do by talking for that reason. And I will definitely say more about this after the break, but I was just curious, Elaine, if what you thought about even just that, the idea of just being able to access parts of ourselves that we otherwise couldn't.
Well, I think that oftentimes too, when we've had trauma, it's hard to access it. We may not even remember what our trauma
Yeah.
is. And so when we work with the body does seem to have an implicit memory about what's happened to us. So I think that we can then um, touch upon places that need to heal in ways that have no words. So I can talk to someone and they can tell me, oh, I had this trauma, but I don't want to talk about it. And I said, well, as you're just even sitting there with me right now, what do you notice happening on the inside? And so they may let me know that their nervous system is getting activated, like maybe their heart is starting to beat faster and their muscles are tight. And that's the moment that I know that there are things that I can do to help alleviate the suffering in the body that actually magically and marvelously helps to also unlock more healthful thoughts about what may have happened to us, even if we can't remember all the elements of the story. And that's where, to me, the work becomes sacred,
Yeah.
because it can touch places where people thought they would never heal from. And I think we both have seen people say to us, I never thought I could feel this way,
Yeah.
and get back a part of myself, or maybe be the self that I always hoped I would be. And I feel like something has left me that I needed to release.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean to forget, but it means that it doesn't hold me back, that I can be all the ways that I want to be in mind, body, and spirit. So I think that's what we both seen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a break right now. I knew that with this time would go very fast with you. And when we come back with Reena uh, Patel, social worker extraordinaire, we are going to talk a little bit more. We're going to talk a lot more about what this is embodied healing mean, and give you some more ideas about it, because I think it will be important for our listeners to know, if you're suffering, how can you, even in a little way, start to feel better? So we'll be back in a few minutes with Reena Patel and continue our conversation. We'll take a short break.
Email to Elaine.
Welcome back. This is Elaine Miller-Karras, and I'm with Reena Patel.
Show.
And Reena is the Director of Education for the Trauma Resource Institute. And we've been talking about the Trauma Resiliency Model and the Community Resiliency Model and the work that we're doing. We got a message from one of our Community Resiliency Model teachers on our break. And so we want to do a shout out to Bo Dean from Wilmington, North Carolina. He's from New Hanover County, and he's been the leader in he's been one of the leaders in that part of our country that has been leading an amazing resiliency task force. I'm going to have him come back on again, Reena.
Yes.
But he does a lot of creative things, and we're so happy that he's part of our family. But I think this is kind of leads us to the questions about, what is it about these two models?
Yeah.
And I just mentioned what I think right before the break about working with the body is so powerful. And there is this amazing connection to when our body enters that state of well-being, and we can sense that deeper breath. We can sense our muscles relax. That if I ask people, do you have any thoughts, any new feelings, meanings about this challenge that you have? People tend to say the most amazing things, and they come up with their own solutions to their own problems.
Yeah.
And sometimes they are just amazingly sacred. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about your experience and what that's been like for you.
Yeah, and Elaine, as you say that, the piece about the wisdom that comes, I can't help but think that that's that wisdom that, it's implicit in us, right? But it also can be implicit from generations prior. I mean, the wisdom that we do have access to once we are able to work with our bodies and the things that can come to us. And I want to unpack a little bit about what culture is, since we are talking about the embodiment of culture, because this is very much how I've come to these models, and really I think have deep gratitude for what it's given me in my own lived experience, my own nervous system. But when we think about culture, we think about a way of life, right? How we interact with the world, the languages we speak, the food that we eat, rituals, customs. I mean, all of that is culture, right? And I think when I came to this model, I came to this model first, the trauma resiliency model, as a receiver of these skills. I didn't quite understand what was happening. I just knew that this was helpful and it worked for me. I think what happened for me culturally, because of the trauma I was going through, was so based in my culture that I needed permission to have choice of what I wanted to hold on to, what I wanted to let go. And I think that's the other piece of this model that's so sacred and incredible, is that I think when we talk about culture, yes, it's important to celebrate culture, but I think it's just as important to say that there are parts of culture that can also be traumatic, that can be hard. So when I think about some of the things I've went through, I think about patriarchy and how that's manifested in my body through my culture, right? And so being able to be a receiver of these skills in my body, it felt like deep, deep work that was being done, not just for myself, but also for my grandmothers and great grandmothers, right? And for the future. And so I think, for me, when I think about how this model has impacted me as somebody in my lived experience and what I bring to the table, I think about that and I get a choice of what I want to pay attention to. Whether that, and so I wanted to say that because I think that to me has been one of the most sacred things about
Well,
culture.
and also, you had shared about that you married your wonderful husband, Adam, who I have met and I know, um, who is Mexican, but to also leave the cultural paradigm and to say to one's parents, I'm going to have a choice. That must not have been easy. And I imagine there are many people all over our country and other countries that are facing that same dilemma, is that if you fall in love, that doesn't necessarily, that's certainly something that we have embraced in the West, but that hasn't been embraced in every culture. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that or not.
Well, what I'll say about that is I think I had to find a place of home in my own body first before I was able to find the courage to do that. And I think, I also recognize I have great privilege in being safe in my decision to do that. I know that people are wanting to figure out how to be with people they love, and it's not a safe situation for them around the world or even here in the United States and what that looks like. So I want to acknowledge that I have that privilege of being safe, but also that I wasn't able to find the courage to make that decision until I was able to come together, mind, body, spirit, around what that meant for me. It took that type of work to do that. And I don't know if I would have ever gotten there if I just worked with my thoughts around that and going back and forth about if this was the right decision or not. I don't know if I would have gotten there.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that. So maybe we could talk about the trauma resiliency model, because we've talked a lot about the community resiliency
Yeah.
model on the show, but the trauma resiliency model is something that I created and helped develop. There were two women that were involved in the very beginning, Jeannie Everett and Lori Leach, but I kind of have taken it forward. They kind of went on and did their own things. But I think one of the core values of the model was that we wanted to bring in a biological approach. We wanted to make it accessible to people in the mental health field, but we wanted to make it accessible to people in the mental health field so that they would have, along with other approaches that were more cognitive in thinking, that they could have a biological model that they could take that didn't cost an arm and a leg, and they could learn the essentials of working with the body. And then we went on to create trauma resiliency model level 1 and level 2. And now through the Trauma Resource Institute, we have, I think is it every month we have
Yeah,
trainings going on, and we have a lot of I guess interest in these models right now, because I know that you
absolutely.
keep yourself busy in finding enough of our faculty to be able to respond to the desire about them, to want to take the trainings. But I think that one of the reasons why I think they've been so embraced is because we have simplified very complex subjects, um, so that it can be transferable to clients in a
Yeah,
way that people can understand the neuroscience that has been out there now for a number of years, but in ways that people can hold on to them. And if you're not a neuroscientist, that you can understand, oh, you have a brake and an accelerator of your nervous system. And if you've had a lot of trauma, you can feel like your foot is stuck on the brake and your nervous system is just firing all the time, and you don't sleep, you don't get to rest in the same way. So how can we help you know that you even have a break? How can
right.
we help you learn to read your nervous system? And I think that's when you're talking about choice.
Yeah,
If we have really simplified things and crystallized it to learning to read your nervous system, to tell the difference between sensations of distress and well-being. And when you can tell the difference, you can choose to water the well-being inside your body. And what, if you can speak a little bit to what you have seen and how that plays out across cultures that you've worked with.
Yeah, it's something that comes to mind that I've been really following a lot of clinicians around, is this idea of decolonizing our strategies and our mental health approaches. And I find it fascinating with the work that we're doing with this idea of choice, because it really is about sharing power with the clients, right? It's not about power over their body or their experiences. And I do believe that that is what I've seen when I've done this work, whether it be in the military, you know, or in Indigenous communities, or in my own community, or whatever that looks like, but that I'm sharing this power versus having power over someone in my role as therapist. And I think, you know, even just recently, I'm thinking, Elaine, of a training we just did 2 weeks ago. I had 4 different countries represented just in my small group. Why are folks attracted to what we're doing, right? It's because of that piece of just being able, like you said, to have skills, one that you can use right away, right? But also the piece around that choice, and also being able to come to someone and say that we honor your lived experiences and your body and your culture, and not prescribe in a way that does feel like we're repeating patterns of power also, because as you know, in our field, that has been historically what we've done, right, in a lot of interventions. And so I think that does attract a lot of people to the work that we're doing. And I do think that we do it a little differently than other somatic models, because we do give a lot of choice at every step of the way. We are with you and we're giving choice.
Right. So it's less about, it's like we don't direct, this is what you have to do. We'll say, well, we invite you to do this. You can do it or not do it.
Or not. Yeah.
This may be helpful to you or not. And the or not becomes very powerful when, especially when you've had a lot of trauma and all choice was taken away from you. But I think the decolonization too, and this kind of is not necessarily embraced by all mental health therapists, is we're saying we're not going to be directive and saying, or interpretive and
Right.
saying, well, I think you're doing this because when you were 10, your parents got a divorce. If that's your story, and if that's what you would like to believe, you know, we can, we'll have a discussion about it. But we would ask the person, well, what do you think from this
Exactly.
place, when you get into this place inside your body of knowing and feeling that you are coming from the best part of yourself, and you look at your life and say,
Yes.
so would it be helpful for you to talk about what happened or not? And believe it or not, some people don't want to talk about what happened to them
Right.
because they know that it's not where they are right now. It doesn't mean that they're avoiding talking about the past. People often say to me, well, are you saying that we don't have to talk about the trauma story? And I said, yeah, I am saying that. And people go, well, wait a second, that's how we heal. Well, not necessarily. And I really want all of our listeners to know this, that may not be your pathway for healing.
Right.
Your pathway of healing can be from finding a therapist who works with the body in the way that helps unwrap the body's story to what happened to you, where you can actually all of a sudden have a new meaning about what's happened to you that you can say, which may be, I've heard people say, well, you know, it's not so important that I know what happened to me, because right now, from this place inside of myself, I feel like I have touched the deeper part of my soul, my sacred core. And from here, I can go forward in a new way. But that's not something I can say, oh, well, forget about what happened in the past, right? That has to come from the person. And that's where we call it the decolonization. And actually, some people have called it the democratization of mental health, because of that philosophy, which I do think comes from a deep place within myself.
Yeah.
As a woman and as a person who worked for many years as a doula, helping women have their babies through very, childbirth is painful, but that didn't mean that a person couldn't be gently guided through this most painful experience of their life, physical experience, and be nurtured and embraced within the suffering. And even though people say, well, how is that similar to, trauma? It is similar to trauma, because it's being with someone, not being necessarily directed about what you are supposed to do.
Yeah.
But in terms of knowing, seeing what's there, maybe having an understanding of the rhythms of the body, that you can say, well, it might be something, if you'd like to or not, to take a walk right now. We suggest that in our trauma resiliency model work, in our community resiliency model work. And if a person says, no, I don't want to go for a walk right now, then it's fine, we'll just sit here together, right? So there's
Yeah.
that invitation. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of your experience across cultures.
Well, and I do want to ask you a question about that, Elaine. And before I do, I want to also acknowledge that I think the other thing I've seen across cultures is the how gently we come into the body. And it's something I've heard actually, and from people from many different walks of life, is the approach is gentle. And so it makes me think of your work as a doula and what
Yes.
that looks like, because it is coming in a way that is kind, supportive, and like you said, being with someone. And I love that. And that is something I've heard cross-culturally from folks, is that it does feel that way. And so my question to you, Elaine, is, as you talk about, how this really comes from deep inside of you, is that I know you've called yourself a feminist, and in many ways.
An old
And,
feminist
and
now,
all
an old
feminists.
feminist, yes.
But I'm curious because I know the trauma world, especially when you started this, was so governed by male, male figures, scholars, activists, and mental health professionals. What was your aim in bringing this forward as a woman and as a feminist? What were you hoping to do differently with this approach?
It's interesting. Well, I was hoping, to make it accessible, affordable, um, making it invitational, and also coming from the stance that my client knew more about what happened to them than I did, and that I could guide them to maybe thinking about things in a different way. But ultimately, it was their journey. And I was there, I'm hoping, as a gentle guide in helping them learn how to learn about their body, not just to even learn, and also learning about their body, but how the body and mind are connected. And that they on their own could see that once they started sensing their body in a different way, like not so constricted and open, that also had affected their cortex and how they started thinking about themselves. But I think that what I've learned is that we do live in a patriarchal system. And I can think about going to conferences, and that to see that, especially in the beginning, I've been doing this for a long time, that there were oftentimes many, many men who were the presenters, and the majority of the audience, probably 3/4, were women. There were more women therapists than the men, but the men were the leadership. I always thought that was kind of interesting, and not to say that I, learned from all of them in different ways, but I do think that there have been experiences I've had where women's thoughts have not been as embraced. They've been more questioned. And I've certainly had some very difficult situations that, even with my kindness and wanting to come forward in a way that's invitational, wasn't always received that way. So I learned that that I had to keep going, knowing that from the best part of myself, I was doing something that, and I didn't say this, but someone said this to me one time: Elaine, what you're doing can change 7 generations. And I said, oh, come on. You probably say that to everybody. But now that we've done the work, and this was many years ago, and we're like 15 years into the work, and to see that, we are in 75 countries, I would never have imagined that. But I think part of it has been the approach, and also that dedication to continue, even when someone said you couldn't, or that, who are you to do this, and have this idea, that has been said to me by many men, sadly, right? Who are you to do this? And who are you to do this as a social worker as well? Because as you and I both know, there's also hierarchy in the mental health system. And that's not to say that I have many friends that are psychiatrists and psychologists that I know we have a co-respectful relationship. But sometimes I think in society, we look at things from this patriarchal perspective that I think is not the best for all of society, that also think, even if their biological base, can still see things from a top-down kind of arrogant perspective, and not one that embraces. So it hasn't been an easy road, honestly, but it's been a worthwhile road. I wouldn't change it for 1 minute. certainly no one wants to experience trauma as they're on this journey of trying to bring an idea of healing to the world, but we do. Because I think anything that's worth a darn, I could say a damn, is sometimes you have to live through suffering. And from that suffering, I have to say, every suffering that I've had, I've learned from. So one of the things I learned, and this is important for anybody that's thinking about, oh, I'm going to create something, is that if you know something and you're coming from the best part of yourself and you're coming with um, ethics and morality and with that respecting people and the gentleness of this, keep going no matter what anybody says to you. Keep trying. You know, we now have research behind us. We have from very um, respected institutions. But if I would have stopped back in the beginning because of maybe powerful men, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So it was the knowing that I had to go forward with it, even through the suffering of it. And that doesn't mean that everything I did was correct. I learned from my mistakes and I made plenty of them. But every time you go through something like that, hopefully as a human being, part of what we can do is learn, oh gosh, I'll never do that again. And we hopefully make amends for what we've done and ask for forgiveness if we've done something that's harmed others. Not always will our requesting forgiveness be accepted, but I have tried to walk in that way. And I have to say that my life, and I've lived a long life, my life is behind me. It has been a very meaningful life that's been full of suffering and joy and laughter. And it has been a heck of a journey, and I'm still here. So God knows. But I think it's really important that there is a patriarchy that I think still exists. And there's also something that we call misogyny, and that's, almost like hating women, and that all misogynists are not men. And so sometimes misogynists are women because they have swallowed the patriarchy and then they start acting that way. And when I say, men and women, I also want all of you to know that identify as non-binary. I'm not leaving you out. It's just that when I was growing up, we didn't have non-binary. And I often think that I'm so proud of people that are transgender and are non-binary and they're speaking up, because I think that that's courage. Because as we know that for some of them, it means, my life. And certainly I've seen so much change in my lifetime in my friends who are gay and lesbian, transgender, that they couldn't say who they were. And at least, more and more people, of course, have spoken out who they are. And that's certainly changed our world. But I'm bringing that into the equation because I think it has to do with staying with something that's right, even if so many people are saying it's wrong, or how can you do that? And don't you know the implications of this? And I see the good that we do. I see the good that we're doing with children and how people are changing. And there's something also that I want to make sure that I state, because some people have said to me, well, you're just teaching people how to, self-regulate. Isn't that a way of controlling society? And it's just the opposite of that. When we help people understand their biology, it's empowering. And it's like, a person saying to one of our therapists, my body's been talking to me my entire life, but I didn't know how to talk back. And here we're teaching people how to not only understand what happens to them when they have stress and trauma, but how to talk back to their body to bring them into a place of healing. And that to me is empowerment. And that's, I think, one of the primary reasons that I keep doing this, because I've seen it all over the world. And to see a little boy in Haiti or a little boy in India and see them change because they've recognized that they can. Oh my gosh, how can I not keep doing this as long as I live? Now, seeing that we only have a few minutes left too, Reena, you've asked me that question. So is there any parting thought that you want to say as we're ending today?
I think to speak to what you just said about, isn't self-regulation a means of control? I would say my own life is an example of how that is not true, that it was only until I learned to do that I was able to become the most powerful version of myself. And I continue to evolve and to change the things I want to change in my life and the structures I want to be a part of and not a part of. And I've seen that time and time again with people I've worked with both trim and crim, that once they are able to do that, that the best parts of themselves come up. And that is where I do think we have hope to change the world, and that I do think that we can make a difference. And so I would say, I just wanted to be with you in that thought, that I have seen the absolute opposite, right, in the work that I've done with these models and what we do. And I certainly have lived that in my own life as well.
And so I would say empowerment. And I kind of want to end with when a long time ago, Reena said to me, "Oh, Elaine, we have to go to the Tata Institute and we have to share this with the women that I've met, the people that I've met at the Tata Institute that are social workers, the oldest school of social work in Asia." And we got to go. It was such a delight. And I have to tell you, she was right. They just embraced the model with such joy. And we had the best day there, didn't we?
It was.
In sharing this. And I've never seen you. I mean, I've seen you happy, but you were pretty happy that day.
I don't
that
think I
we
could
were
have
there.
smiled any bigger
I
that
don't
day.
think so. I don't think so. So, well, my dear friend and colleague, it's been so great to have you on the show. You're always inspiring to me. And I definitely think you were empowered. So you don't have to worry about that. You definitely got that one going. And I say that with all the
Thank you,
love in the
Elaine.
world. So I just want to say to our listeners from around the world, thank you for coming and listening to Resiliency Within. Remember what else is true in your life. Remember that each one of us can start paying attention to the sensations of well-being. Remember our app, I Chill, that we have in English and in Spanish, and also soon, maybe next week, in Ukrainian for our Ukrainian colleagues in that are suffering right now. And we just want to wish you all a good week, and remember what else is true about life, and remember your strengths. And until we meet again, this is Elaine Miller-Karras signing off with my dear friend, Reena Patel, social worker extraordinaire. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.